Hello. There we go. Okay. Hello, cool cats and kittens. It is me, Mr. Hunter, your educator for today. We're gonna get into the Cold War now. So here we have it. The United States versus the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR. Democracy versus communism. Capitalism versus socialism. Doodly doo. The American flag. The Soviet Union's flag. The sickle and hammer. The stars and bars. Doodly doo. Okay. Oh, and Rocky. I think this is Rocky 4. Excellent. Excellent film, Rocky 4. That's your assignment. Watch Rocky 4. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, we're not going to watch this video, but I highly recommend if you should watch this video to supplement this video as well. Okay? Oh. Whoa, we're watching a video in a video? Am I a React channel? React channel! No. Okay. So, remember, let's go back a little bit and we'll talk about the United States and the Soviet Union during the World War II. Okay, so in 1939, Stalin and Hitler are basically they make a deal. It's called the Nazi-Soviet Pact, and basically it says that Hitler told Stalin what his plans were in Europe, but that they're not going to mess with Russia. Okay, we're not going to mess with Russia, says Hitler, and Hitler said thank you. Well, in 1941, Hitler sees an opportunity to betray him, and I don't really know the history of this. This is actually something that I've always wanted to know more. I've always wanted to know more why Hitler did this. I don't really know. Anyway, Hitler will betray Stalin and invade the Soviet Union, and now all of a sudden the Soviet Union is an ally, meaning it now has a common enemy with France, England, and the United States, which also joins in 1941. 1941 was not a great year for the Nazis, I guess. Okay, so before the war, the end of World War II. Before the end of World War II, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt will meet at Yalta to develop a plan about what should happen. Okay, so now we've got these three big powers, right? Okay, you've got Winston Churchill, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin, kind of the three major countries of the Allies in World War II, and they wanted to know how should peace happen? What should we do with Germany? How should we move forward? You guys get the idea. So they agreed on some major points. The establishment of the United Nations, which was really an American goal to create an international peacekeeping organization to prevent these things from happening again. You remember, we just had a World War I, just 30, 40 years before, 30 years before or so, and they tried to create something called the League of Nations, and it failed. So they're going to try again with the United Nations. Number two, we're going to divide Germany into 4 zones. Now you're probably thinking, well, there's 3 major powers. Who's the 4th? France. And why didn't we include France in this conversation? I don't know. Number 3, that free elections would be allowed in the states of Eastern Europe. We'll see how well that holds out. And Russia will help the United States in its war with Japan, although that won't really be needed. Russia will just start to move against Japan when we drop the atom bomb. And then no agreement was really reached on Poland, but that doesn't really matter as far as our conversation. So that's how the war ends. So what is the Cold War now? We're going to shift into the Cold War now for real. So the Cold War is defined as a political, strategic, and ideological struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union that will spread throughout the world. And I'm going to explain all this in this video. Okay? It is a struggle that contained everything short of war. Now, I'm going to add a clarifying comment to this in just a second. It is really rooted in the competing social and economic ideologies between these two countries, although there is definitely war. So when I say that, when we call the Cold War cold, and when we make statements like a struggle that contained everything short of war, that is not really true. In fact, I should probably just reword that. It's more like this: cold, because the United States and the Soviet Union did not fight directly. And this is very important. The Cold War is only cold because the United States and the Soviet Union did not fight directly. How can you fight indirectly? We'll talk about that. as we keep going. So, key concept. Guiding question. How did the Cold War affect the domestic and foreign policies of the United States? Sorry, I got distracted. My 3-year-old is pretending to be an old woman, and it was adorable. Okay, so where were we? How did the Cold War affect the domestic and foreign policies of the United States? Meaning, how did it impact America, and how did it impact the world? The rest of the world. Okay? Or how we interacted with the rest of the world. Okay, here we go. McCarthyism and the Red Scare. We'll talk more about that later. What? HUAC? HUAC? I can't remember what that is at all. Let's look it up. See, guys, this is what you do when you don't know something. What is HUAC? Oh, yeah, the House of Un-American Activities Committee. Okay, I just never seen it acronymized. Acronymized? Put it in the comments. Acronymized. I don't know. So this is connected. The McCarthyism and the House. Oh, I could have just clicked. What an idiot. The House Un-American Activities Committee is connected to McCarthyism and the Red Scare. We'll talk about that. Loyalty oaths is connected. And blacklists. I think we're going to talk about that later on, so I'm going to save it. Okay, we'll get into this more. I'll explain what these things are later. But just in case we don't, let me give you a quick rundown. Joseph McCarthy, a senator from Minnesota, was him and many other Americans were so afraid that the Russian policy of Russian-style communism was invading and infecting the United States that they created it. He kind of led the creation of the House of Representatives, created what they called the Un-American Activities Committee. What does that mean? That's right. Their job was to look into people who were behaving in ways that weren't American, that maybe were displaying beliefs or philosophies or doing things that were un-American and were pro-Soviet. And that sounds crazy, because it is, and Joseph McCarthy was a paranoid lunatic. He will ask people to basically swear loyalty oaths to the United States. Specifically, they're going to target actors and like Hollywood, and you'll see these weird trials set up where actors and producers and writers are asked, are you communist? Or I heard you were talking about communism at this party once. Someone said you mentioned communism. Are you loyal to America? And they're like, yeah, I don't know why you guys are wigging out. But ironically, in America, aren't we free to believe in whatever economic policy we want? Well, not according to Joseph McCarthy and the House Un-American Activities Committee. So they were forced to sign these loyalty oaths, and if they didn't, or if they were suspected of interacting with other communists, they were put on a blacklist. And they were banned from working in Hollywood. You can find these blacklists online if you Google it. Okay? So, and of course the bomb shelter. The bomb shelter is ubiquitous with this time period. Because of the threat of war with Russia, of nuclear war, remember we have the nuke now because of World War II, Americans were building bomb shelters in their backyard. In fact, there's a really funny movie with Brendan Fraser called Blast from the Past, about a dad it's during the Cold War, really scared. He thinks there's a bomb. It's just a drill. So he forces his family down into this bomb shelter, and they emerge like 60 or 50 years later or whatever, or 40 years later, and he has to try to deal with this new world. It's pretty funny. You should check it out. It's called Blast from the Past. I really like it. So the bomb shelter, just like this, built underground where you could live for, in theory, years, waiting for nuclear fallout to end. Man, you guys think our quarantine is tough. Woo! Can you imagine? Crazy. Okay. Foreign policies. The Korean War, which we'll talk more about, for sure. The arms race, which we'll talk more about, for sure. The Truman Doctrine, which you'll definitely talk more about. And MAD, which stands for Mutually Assured Destruction. And we'll get into these more. Let's go. So, what were the 6 major strategies of the Cold War? So here we have Stalin driving the ship of the CCCP or the USSR. That's the Russian letters for the USSR. I don't know how to say it in Russian. Right? Here we have the United Nations logo. We've got U.S. aid. We'll talk about that. Here we have, I believe this is Khrushchev and JFK. We'll talk about them later in the 50s. And their battle, see their missiles, their hydrogen bombs, and see how their fingers are right above the button and they're fighting. We've got spy versus spy. We've got Vietnam and Korea. believe that's right. Yeah, Vietnam and Korea, the Vietnam and Korean Wars. Okay, so the 6 major strategies that these two countries, our country, the United States, and the Soviet Union engaged in were: 1, brinksmanship. What brinksmanship means, basically, a plan or a policy of threatening basically really violent, intense actions to try to get your opponent to break. So if, let's say, somebody wants to pick a fight with you, right? And they're like, meet me outside by the flagpole. And you're like, okay, and you show up, and then they do all these crazy moves, and they've got like swords, and they've got like tattoos on their face, and they're all crazy, and you're like, oh, geez, this guy's not playing around. This guy looks crazy. Brinkmanship is the idea that they're willing to basically push it to the brink. They're willing to push it to the edge of total destruction. That if Khrushchev thinks that JFK is willing to end the world, then Khrushchev is going to give. If JFK thinks that Khrushchev's crazy, I'll do it, man. I'll push the button. I'm not afraid. I'm a crazy man. Then JFK, in theory, then America would break. The idea was that both of these countries were kind of pretending, they were threatening to cross the line to total destruction. And we'll talk about mutually assured destruction later, which is similar. Okay? Espionage. Here we have spy versus spy. I don't know if you guys ever read this comic, but massive espionage, which is basically means spying during this time, where the Soviet Union had spies embedded into the American government. We had spies in the Soviet Union. You'll talk about these. There's a TV show called The Americans. I don't remember what it's rated, but it's all about a family of Russian spies that are still here in America since the Cold War. It's actually kind of interesting. My wife and I tried it. We didn't really get into it, but if you want to check it out, it's called The Americans, I believe. Foreign aid, and we'll talk more about foreign aid in a minute, but basically both the Soviet Union and the United States will give millions of dollars of aid to European countries to basically try to buy loyalty. So Russia will give aid to Eastern European countries to try to basically buy their loyalty so they would remain loyal to the Soviet Union, and the United States will give lots and lots of money to mostly Western European countries to try to maintain influence, to try to buy their loyalty. Okay? Alliances. And like I kind of insinuated there, we're going to see that almost the entire world will be split. Those countries that are loyal to the Soviet Union and those countries that are loyal to the United States. You'll see almost a 50-50 split on the whole world. And I'll show you a map later, I'm pretty sure. And if I don't, I'll try to remember. And there was, of course, lots and lots of propaganda, as you can see here, with Stalin looking real boss. Driving the ship, right? Oh, excuse me. Don't be afraid. Stalin's mustache is here, driving us to safety. And there was, of course, American propaganda as well, which I'll show some of you later. And then surrogate wars. Okay, a surrogate. If you guys ever heard of that term before, a surrogate. So a surrogate mother, you may have heard of this, is like when somebody will have a baby for someone else when maybe they can't have a baby, so they'll be impregnated with that person's egg or whatever, and then it'll be their baby, and then they give it away. You've heard the term surrogate mother. So a surrogate war is also known as a proxy war or a satellite war, which basically means that while what I said was true, that the Soviet Union and the United States didn't fight directly, we will have surrogate wars. So we will fight a war in Korea and a war in Vietnam, in which the United States will get directly involved in these fights, meaning we will send troops. But the Soviet Union won't send troops directly. They will give money and aid and support via China, and then China will give money, aid, and support to Vietnam and Korea. So we're fighting indirectly. That's why it's called a surrogate war. Okay? So what did the United States want? So the United States wanted to promote open markets and to stop the spread of communism. Okay? We wanted to promote democracy and stop this icky communism thing from spreading. Okay? It's dumb. They wanted to prevent the domino effect, which basically said that if the idea was that if one country becomes communist, it's only, I guess it'd be over here, that it's only a matter of time before another country becomes communist, another, and before the whole world has fallen to the evil that is communism. And we'll get more into that a little bit later. Okay, so what did the USSR want? Well, here's a quote from Winston Churchill. the leader of well, actually, let's read that quote in a minute. He's the leader of England. So what the Soviet Union wanted was a greater sense of security. So remember, Russia had just fought two terrible, terrible wars. They had lost more people in World War One and in World War Two than any other country. Very bloody, very bad. And so they wanted to basically protect themselves from the outside world. They wanted to insulate. So they're fearing another strong Germany. They wanted to establish defensible borders from basically getting into the USSR, and they did, of course, want to spread communism. They thought that it was their. Oh, excuse me. Oh, I'm yawning. I don't think I've talked this much today. That as much as it was important to have communism in Russia, communism was inevitable. They believed all across the world. So here's what they wanted. So if you look at this map, this is the territory that the Soviet Union will gain during the war. And these are going to be the countries that are under communist control, under the control of the Soviet Union. So look at all these countries. Now, Russia doesn't start here. This is the official boundary of the Soviet Union. But these countries are all under Soviet control. And Yugoslavia is communist but independent. Wink, wink, right? They're definitely not under the control of the Soviet Union. Wink, wink, right? Okay, anyway. This red line, we call it the Iron Curtain. And these green countries are known as buffer states. I need you to remember that. Buffer states. These are countries that are not technically part of the Soviet Union, but are loyal to the Soviet Union. They're communist. They're heavily involved in Russian affairs. And the idea that is now they've got this kind of insulation from the West. So we've got West Germany, and we'll talk about the division of Germany in a minute. Italy, Austria, you've got France over here, Spain, Portugal, the United Kingdom over here, right? And then, of course, the United States on the other side of the pond. That these countries will, in theory, keep Western influence out. There's like a thick blockade, right, of keeping Western influence out. So what is this Iron Curtain? Well, Winston Churchill came up with the term, and let's read this quote so you know what it means. Okay, it says, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, okay, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere, and all are subject in one form or another not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and in some cases increasing measure of control from Moscow, the capital of Russia." Right? That behind this line, the Soviets are in charge, and then on this side of the line, you could say the Allies are in charge, or the Brits, or the Americans. You can kind of look at both of those as in charge, quote unquote. Okay, so can you see how we've kind of divided Europe? East versus West, communism versus capitalism. We kind of have these new superpowers shaping. Okay, the Marshall Plan. Like I told you, we're going to try to bribe Western Europe, essentially. So, Secretary of State George Marshall during the war recommends that, unlike World War I, where the countries were kind of left to themselves, that the United States should give lots and lots and lots and lots of money to help Europe rebuild for two reasons. Okay, two motives. Helping Europe will recover economically, and then they will be ready to buy American stuff. If Europe doesn't have any money, they ain't buying Coca-Cola, they ain't buying Ford cars, they ain't buying John Deere tractors. So if we fix their economy, they can buy stuff and make us rich. And secondly, a prosperous Europe would be better able to resist the spread of communism. Meaning, if they have money, they're not going to be tempted to join up with a communist philosophy. Makes sense. So this Marshall Plan was very, very popular, and here you see, whatever the weather, we must move together. All these countries are loyal. We got Spain, England, Greece, Turkey, Sweden, Italy, France, I believe, right? Switzerland. Wait, that's not Italy. It's Ireland. That's Italy. I don't know what that one is. Germany, right? Yeah, and look, America is the weather vane, right? We're guiding all of these countries, the vane that guides the windmill, okay? It was really successful. These countries will remain loyal to the United States. This is Portugal. Um, Very good. So there's a crisis right away in 1948. It's called the Berlin Crisis. So here's a map of Germany, and I want you to understand that we didn't really know what to do with Germany. Russia didn't really want to have full control. We didn't trust Russia to have full control of Germany, and they didn't trust us to have full control. So we divided it up. In the top sector here of Germany, you see the Brits are in control, and somehow the Americans have this little bit. I don't know why. The French have control of this section, which makes sense because that's the part that touches France. The Americans have this bottom section, the southeastern section, and then the Russians will have control of the northeastern section. Now, because Berlin was in the northeastern section, we didn't want the Russians to have full control over Berlin. So what they did, if you see here, imagine that you zoomed in here, right? Zoomed in. We've divided Berlin into 4 sections as well. So all of Germany had 4 sections, and then within Berlin, 4 sections. France, England, America, and Russia. So we split it in 50-50. The Allies get half, and the Russians get half. But if you noticed, British, French, and American territory is surrounded by Russian territory. So what happens is this. I already explained that. We want the western part of Germany to become independent. And Stalin didn't like this. He did not want Germany to go back into independence. He wanted to leave it under the control of the Allies. And so what happened was Stalin will cut off the railroads that resupply the British and the French and the American sectors of Berlin. He isolates them, hoping to starve them into submission. And Berlin would fall under the control of Russia. Well, the Americans said, and then the British said, no, sir. No, sir, that's a bad idea. We're not going to do that. I was like Australian or something, huh? And then the French said, no, we're going to not do that. And so what they did instead was they put supplies in airplanes. They flew from probably in the American sector or the British sector, and they flew and they airdropped supplies into Berlin, West Berlin, and eventually the USSR goes, oh, they're getting their supplies, and they lift the blockade, and then they open up the rails and roads again. Now, why does this matter? It doesn't really matter as far as the consequences, but it's an early indication that the Soviet Union and the West, the East and the West, that the Soviet Union and the Americans and Brits are not going to get along. We're not going to move forward working together. Okay? Oh, that wasn't the UN flag. That's the NATO flag. So what is NATO? That's right. I lied to you back here. No, I don't want to go back all the way. I lied to you. Sorry. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was created by Western states that wanted to work together under a trade agreement. So here they all are. Basically, this would allow us to coordinate trade and defense against the United Soviet Socialist Republic. Okay? These countries would work together to resist the influence of the Soviet Union. Okay? And by 1991, some former Soviet republics have now applied for membership of NATO. NATO still exists. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization still exists as a common defense and trade organization. Obviously not against the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore, but more so just as like I said, like a trade and defense agreement. Okay? But why does it matter? Because look, the West has now teamed up. We now have like a team called the West, the North Atlantic, right? If you think about what countries share the North Atlantic, all of these countries they all have a border with the North Atlantic. Okay, now let's contrast that with another team. This team is called the Warsaw Pact, named after Warsaw, Poland. And it was an organization of communist states in Central and Eastern Europe. Established in 1955, it was a response to NATO. Basically, they're like, oh, you guys want to form a team? We're going to form our own team. Okay, the founding members are, as you see here. So we've got, where are we? Poland, Hungary, Romania, the USSR, East Germany, okay? And it will grow, and I don't think Yugoslavia, no, was that Serbia is kind of involved, I think? Or was that Albania down there? I don't know. Okay. Why is this important? Because the world is now divided. Europe is now divided again. We just finished a World War II and we're already breaking up into another set of alliances. Alliances were the cause of World War I and World War II. And here we see ourselves in another set of alliances. Okay, let's move on a little bit. Okay, Harry Truman. Let's talk about Truman Doctrine. So in 1947, the British will get involved to help the Greeks fight against communist guerrillas fighting there, not the monkey, like underground fighters. Greece is trying, there are some people in Greece trying to start a communist revolution just like there was in Russia, and England will get involved and help stop them. So will the United States. God, what's it called? I can't remember what that's called. The Greek intervention when we get involved in Greece. I can't remember what it's called. America then realizes that we cannot allow these states, these countries, to fall to communism. And so Truman and his administration promises the world that if any government wants help to resist communism, to maintain freedom, that you will have America's assistance. And this is known as the Truman Doctrine. So what is the Truman Doctrine? The Truman Doctrine is the guarantee that if any country needs help resisting communism, that the Americans will supply weapons, money, and troops to resist the spread of communism. In a nutshell, the Truman Doctrine is that America's going to stop the spread of communism all across the world. Okay? And here's what I mean. The Truman Doctrine will continue all the way through the 50s and 60s and 70s, which we'll talk more about later. But understand that Greece was really one of the first times. We'll also do it. Greece, I want to say Turkey. There's another one. Greece, somewhere else. Another early one, I can't remember. The big ones are Korea and Vietnam. Okay, we refer to this stopping the spread of communism as containment. Meaning, communism, oh man, it takes forever to go back on this stupid thing. Communism already exists in the Soviet Union and in Poland and in Hungary, right? In these countries. Communism's already there. It would be great to get them to stop being communist, but they already have it, right? We're going to try to contain it. Now, this sounds a lot like the current language around COVID-19, doesn't it? Around the coronavirus. That we're going to try to restrict the spread like a virus. We're going to contain it to the Soviet Union. Okay? So after World War II, each occupying country was supposed to withdraw their troops from German territories, but the Soviet Union did not do that. The Soviet Union wanted to maintain control, maintain influence in those buffer states, like I already told you, and the United States and Britain were nervous about this. So we began what we called the domino theory, right? Which is that that the Soviet Union is communist, and that if it spreads through Asia, it's only a matter of time it spreads throughout the rest of the world. So the United States will get directly involved in these 4 countries, but never really in Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, or India that I know of. But we will send troops to Korea, Vietnam. We will engage in bombing campaigns in Cambodia and Laos. We have to stop the first to save the rest. If one domino falls, they'll all fall. Right? At least that's what we believed. Unfortunately, we know that's kind of not true, but we didn't know that at the time. Okay. So here's a quick synopsis of the Korean War. So here's what happened. China becomes a communist state in 1949, 1950. Mao Zedong becomes the leader of China. They share a border with Russia. They were heavily influenced by Russia. Korea shares a border with China. Northern Korea becomes heavily influenced by China. And you'll see Korean communists start to grow in power and influence. So here's what happens. The war will reach international proportions, the Cold War, in June of 1950 when North Korea, supplied and advised by the Soviet Union and China, invaded the South. The United Nations, with the United States as the principal participant, joined the war on the side of the South Koreans, and the People's Republic of China came to North Korea's aid. After more than 1 million combat casualties had been suffered on both sides, the fighting ended in June 1953, with Korea still divided into 2 hostile states. Negotiations in 1954 produced no further agreement, and the front line has been accepted as the de facto boundary between North and South Korea. That boundary still exists today. Some of you have heard of Kim Jong-un, the famous dictator of North Korea, and the demilitarized zone that divides the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. I love when dictators name their countries. And then, of course, the Republic of Korea. Check this video out if you want to. It's pretty good. It's called The Korean War, 1950 to 1953. It's got a little cartoon. It's pretty good. We're not going to watch it because I don't want to. Whoa. That's a good announcer for like a weird animation. Huh. Anyway. Okay. Let's go back to America. Okay. So, Senator Joe McCarthy. 1908 to 1957. Let's talk about him real quick. McCarthy, a Republican senator. I already told you that. He gave a speech claiming to have a list of 205 communists in the State Department, in the government, that our American government has been infiltrated by secret spies. By the way, this list was total bogus. It never actually exists. It never actually existed. He lied. McCarthy continued to repeat his groundless charges, changing the numbers from speech to speech. Okay? During the time, one state required pro wrestlers to take loyalty oaths before they could step into the ring. In Indiana, a group of anti-communists indicted Robin Hood and its vaguely socialistic message that the book's hero had a right to rob from the rich and give it to the poor, and forced librarians to pull it from the shelves. They said, Robin Hood's a communist! Get that green guy off my bookshelves! I don't want my kids reading about him! Living in the woods, stealing from rich people. Ugh! And then, of course, the Cincinnati Redlegs, right? The Reds. What are the Russians known as? The Reds. Oh! Right? The Cincinnati Reds are back to the Cincinnati Reds, but I believe they were forced to change their name. Baseball's, yeah. The Cincinnati Reds had to rename themselves the Cincinnati Redlegs because Reds are what the communist Russians called themselves. And we can't have any communism in America. If you want to watch a movie about this whole thing, it's called Good Night and Good Luck from a 2005 movie. I haven't ever seen it, but I heard it's pretty good. It's got some big names in it. Oh, look, there he is, Robert Downey Jr. Jeff Daniels? Oh, George Clooney? Ooh, I don't know. Who's David Strathairn? Anyway. Yeah, if you want to check it out, I guess it's pretty good. So in 1954, the tables turned on McCarthy when he charged that the Army had promoted a dentist accused of being a communist. For the first time, he went on television, and people saw him as a raging psycho. And I would show you some video, but we don't have time. But if you want to, Google videos of Joseph McCarthy wigging out. He was censored by the Senate. He wasn't kicked out of the Senate, but he was censored, meaning he was stripped of his ability to vote by the Senate because he was considered a crazy person, and he will die 3 years later from alcoholism. He snapped. But he is responsible for creating what we call an anti-communist fervor. We also sometimes call it the Red Scare. That McCarthyism is what it's known as, is when people freak out. Now, we actually have a really good example of people freaking out over something that they don't need to freak out about. Because remember that one time that we had this coronavirus spread, and then everyone bought all the toilet paper, and then there's no toilet paper for like a month? I do. Why was there no toilet paper because of a virus? It's a good question, right? People were afraid that they were going to be forced to stay at home, and that they weren't going to be able to have TP. So what happened was a couple people bought toilet paper, and then someone heard, hey, there's no toilet paper at this store. And then a bunch of people ran to other stores because they had heard about the lack of toilet paper, bought all that toilet paper, spreading the news that there was no toilet paper. Oh, no! And it led to this freak out known as the Great Toilet Paper Scare, the Great Run on TP of 2020. I want you to imagine that, except your neighbor might be a communist. There's a communist. Oh, my goodness. Is this actor a communist? Is this guy a communist? Right? That's the idea. Oh, boy. Oh. Almost died. Sorry. In fact, who wrote this book? What's his name? Arthur Miller wrote a play called The Crucible. And the book is about the Salem witch trials in Salem, Massachusetts, right, in the early colonial days. But he wrote it really about McCarthyism, and that in the same way that we were saying, witch, there's a witch, burn her, that Americans were freaking out about, they were recklessly accusing each other of being a communist, and this notion of guilt by association. So when you read this play or watch the movie, great movie, by the way, fantastic, this version with Daniel Day-Lewis and Winona Ryder, when you watch this movie, remember that the author was really trying to say that that we're living in a similar situation as the Salem witch trials, but it's just about communism now. Okay, so in the 50s, things heat up when the United States will continue to work on its bomb program, and we will detonate a bomb in 1952 that was 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb we dropped in Japan. 1,000 times bigger. Russia heard about this, and of course they'll work on their bomb program too. So Russia and the United States are the only two countries with nuclear technology. I don't know if England or France did. I'm sure they did, but they weren't testing them. At least we were testing them, and so were the Soviets. And we just kept making bigger and bigger and bigger bombs. Here's one of the bigger bombs that was detonated at what's called the Bikini Atoll, I believe. Right, here's a picture of what it looked like in Japan on Hiroshima. Look at how there's nothing left. And the bomb that we developed was 1,000 times bigger than this. Thank goodness no nuclear weapon has been used on human beings since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Thank goodness. Either way, it was bad. So this arms race, we call it an arms race because it was the Soviet Union and America competing to have the stronger military, right? Arm meaning firearm or weapons, right? We were competing to have the stronger military capabilities. And it created something called MAD, which means mutually assured destruction. Mutually assured destruction. And it's actually a really interesting phenomena that historians have recognized, that the fact that the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons and the United States had nuclear weapons is probably what kept our two countries from fighting. Meaning, if the Soviet Union launched their weapons on the United States, what would the United States do in return? We would launch our nukes on the Soviet Union. And if the United States launched our nukes on the Soviet Union, what would the Russians do in retaliation? They'd launch their nukes on us. The fact that destruction was mutually assured kept the peace. And it's a really weird thing knowing that there's no war because they're what they call this a zero-sum game. Nobody would win. We would all die. So no one was willing to pull the trigger. Now imagine if just the United States had the bomb, or if just Russia had the bomb. Then maybe a war would have broken out, right? One country thought they could have taken the other country. But because we were very much equals when it came to military power, we never launched any bombs on each other. It'll get dang close, which I'll show you in a minute, but we won't do it. Okay, the space race is an example of this. This is when America will go to the Russians and the Americans will start exploring space. So on April 12th, 1961, Yuri Gagarin becomes the first human being in space, a Russian. The United States will be really bummed about this, and we will kick off our space program to try to be the first people on the moon. And then we will be, just a few years later, when Apollo 11 will land on the moon. So, it depends on how you look at it. Oh, sorry, Yuri Gagarin was the first man on the moon, but Russia was also the first country to put anything into space with their satellite called Sputnik in 1957. The United States lost the first two, which was the first satellite and also the first man in space. And that was a real blow to America's ego. And so we will put a man on the moon. So when you hear Americans talk about the space race, we'll say things like, we won because we put the first man on the moon. And the Russians will say, we won because we had the first satellite and this first man in them, man in space. Either way, again, we were competing for prestige and influence. There he is, Yuri. There's the Apollo 11 mission. Okay. Things heat up again. The U-2 incident. The USSR was aware of an active U-2 spy plane, spy missions that were flying over Russia. We had an airplane called a U-2 that could fly way, 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 way high up in the air, but Russia did not have the technology to stop us from doing that until 1960. And then in 1960, a CIA agent named Gary Powers will be shot down by a Soviet missile. Powers was unable to activate the plane's self-destruct mechanism before he parachuted, and it went right into the hands of the KGB. So the United States will learn of Powers' disappearance over USSR. We will cover it up saying it was a weather plane and it crashed and its pilot had difficulties with his oxygen equipment. And the U.S. official, here's the problem though: the United States say no, that wasn't a spy plane, that was a weather plane that was checking the weather. But here's the problem: the United States didn't realize that the plane crashed intact, and that the Soviets recovered our photo equipment, and they will capture Powers, and they will interrogate him, probably tortured him, until he confesses that he's a spy and that he issued a public apology on Russian television. And this will make America look dumb because we were caught in a lie. We were caught spying, and the international community saw America as kind of a bad guy. Okay? Tensions are increasing. Okay, here's Cuba. Here's Florida. You know the tip of Florida, right? Here's the Florida Keys. Cuba is not far away from Florida, right? Can you guys see how close this is? Here's the Bahamas, right? It's very close. Here's the capital, Havana. So here's what happens. So this is important. You guys need to know this. The Bay of Pigs was an unsuccessful attempt by the United States and Cuban-backed exiles to overthrow the government of the Cuban dictator Fidel Castro. So here's what you need to know. Cuba became a communist country because they had a revolution there. They had a dictator named Fulgencio Batista. Do I talk to you guys about this? I don't think I do. Do I talk to you about it? No, I don't. There was a dictator in Cuba called Fulgencio Batista, and Che Guevara and Fidel Castro will lead a revolution there, overthrowing the Batista, and a bunch of people loyal to him will flee to the United States. They will flee. Loyalists. And Cuba is now a communist country. America is now freaking out because there is a communist country in our backyard. Look how close. Communism was a Korean thing, a Russian thing, a Vietnamese thing. It's now in our backyard. We are collectively losing our minds. Okay? So, just before JFK became president, there was a plan to take a bunch of these people who are loyal to Batista, arm them, train them, as well as some American military personnel, to sail around Cuba and attack Cuba from the Bay of Pigs, this inlet, and then march on Havana to basically cause a counter-revolution to get rid of communism, right? JFK reluctantly agreed. Eisenhower, right, was going to do it, and then JFK didn't really want to do it. He reluctantly agreed, and let's talk about how well it goes. How well do you think it's going to go, guys? You think it's going to go well? Let's see. Okay, so on April 17, 1961, 1,300 exiles, armed with United States weapons, land in the Bahia de Cochinos, Bay of Pigs, and the southern coast of Cuba, hoping... Is that spell hoping? That looks weird. For support from the locals. So their plan was to land, go through the countryside, and say, hey, we're here to save you from evil communism. Come join us. And that they would be like, okay. And they'd grab their guns and they would march on Castro. Okay. So Kennedy was told that if you use your Air Force, you'll give them a better shot. But he didn't like that idea because he thought it was too aggressive. It might cause the Soviet Union to get involved to support their buddy in Cuba. So it failed miserably. Castro and his army will overwhelmingly destroy these exiles. A bunch of people will die. America tries to blame. No, we didn't have anything to do with it. Unfortunately, we're caught. Many people will they'll critique Kennedy from both sides. We didn't do enough, or we did too much. We should never have invaded, or we shouldn't have halfway invaded. We should have full invaded, right? Basically, it makes the United States wary. It makes Castro very wary of the United States, that he can't trust America. Russia is no longer whatever little trust we had. It was very bad. So there's Castro there. Basically, what are they do? Look at his face. What are they do? He's got weird glasses, though, huh? What are they doing? Look at him. It was a swamp, so they couldn't really march. They didn't unload fast enough. By the time they even got on the land, Castro's army was surrounded them, and they were immediately defeated. He's like, look at their faces like, oh, those idiots. Okay? It really sours our relationship with Cuba. Okay? And we don't still have the best relationship with Cuba. It's better now. Anyway, okay, the Berlin Wall. You guys have probably heard about this. Okay, one day in August, the barbed wire fence that divided East and West Germany all of a sudden became a wall. The USSR wanted to stop what they said the invasion of Western imperialism, but what people in the West believe, they really were just trying to stop that the Eastern Germans were trying to prevent East Germans from running away from East Germany because East Germany was really poor and really struggling economically. Um, so that's the wall popped up. Anyway, the wall will become a symbol of the division between the East and West. The wall will function as a symbol of a divided world. Germany is split in half. Okay, you guys remember? Maybe you watched movies when you were kids that take place in the 80s and 90s, um, and they'll talk about East Germans. Like Randy and I were just watching Cool Runnings. Have you guys seen Cool Runnings? The Jamaican bobsled team that takes place in the 80s, and the mean guys who are really mean to the Jamaicans, they're East Germans. They're not Germany. There's East Germany and West Germany. They're different countries. Okay, the wall will be built up to be bigger and bigger and bigger before it becomes this very large complex with a DMZ. And the East Germans had a policy that if they saw someone running across this open land, to shoot. No one was allowed to enter the zones. No one was allowed to go between the East and West Germany who didn't have really like very difficult to get paperwork. Okay, so the Berlin Wall, again, the most important thing I want you to understand is it divided East and West Germany. Excuse me, it divided East and West Berlin. I think I've been saying that wrong this whole video. It's East and West Berlin, not the whole country. The wall didn't go the whole length of East and West Germany. I think I said that. No, it goes the length of Berlin, so it divides East and West Berlin. But it's a symbol, okay? It's a symbol of the division. So here's another example of how big it was. There's the DMZ. Here's the French, right? You cannot go, don't go there. Looking into the German section, the East Germans, or the East, yeah, East German section. Okay, moving on. Now to the really freaky Cuban Missile Crisis. So here's what happens. One day we get a report that Cuba is building missile silos. Russian missile silos are being built. A spy plane was flying over Cuba. They looked at the photos and they see missile silos being built. And these aren't just regular missile silos. These are MRBMs and IRBMs. Medium range ballistic missiles and intercontinental range? What's I stand for? I can't remember. The far ones. But these are medium range. I don't remember what I is. But look at the range of these missiles. So they used to be able they initially they didn't have any missile sites there, but at the very beginning they had MRBMs set up that could hit Washington, hit Dallas, and notice how no one cares about the South. That was kind of mean. But yeah, they have a massive range. And then eventually they will install more missiles that can reach the entirety of the United States. This scared the living heavens out of Americans because before this, we were worried about nuclear submarines somewhere over here launching missiles, but they weren't going to be able to shoot that far. But from the actual island of Cuba, they could launch dozens and dozens of missiles at a moment's notice, effectively destroying all of our major cities. Terrifying. Okay? Bad news bears. So by 62, they lagged behind. However, the Khrushchev will deploy missiles, like I already told you, and it will scare the living heavens out of us. Okay, blah, 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 blah. Okay, Castro wanted to get back at the United States and to keep the United States away from Cuba by threatening them with missiles. Okay, so here's Castro, here's Khrushchev, here's Kennedy. Here's a movie I used to make you guys watch. If you want to watch it, it's really good. It's called 13 Days. Maybe I'll post it to the classroom. If anyone wants to watch it, let me know. It's all about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, so October 15, 1962, it lasted 13 days where we thought we were going to go to nuclear war. Guys, I'm not kidding. Fingers on the button. Like, we were very, very, very close to nuclear war. I need you guys to understand this is the closest we have ever been to total world destruction. Ever. As far as, maybe there's been times that we've been closer than this, but, it's all classified. But basically what happened is that we will put a blockade around Cuba. Oh, there's a lot of writing on this, huh? I'm not going to read it. We put a blockade around Cuba to tell the Russians you can't come to Cuba anymore. Well, the Russians ran the blockade on accident. And the Americans said, if you go past the blockade, we're going to fire. And then they said, you fire, we're firing back, and war is on. Well, they accidentally ran the blockade, literally almost fired on the ship, almost launched the nukes, and luckily that ship turned around at the last minute, and they were able to work out some peace. Okay, the slow thaw. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, coming that close to total world destruction, the next several presidents are going to kind of slow things down a little bit. Nixon will go to China. Richard Nixon, the president in the late 60s and 70s, will go to China, which was a crazy move. Like, an American went to a communist state, right? Look at all these presidents: Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, and Bush. Those are all Cold War presidents. And by the time you get to Nixon, Ford, Carter, we're slowly thawing, right? If you guys notice movies from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the bad guys are always Russians, right? Um, this is set in the 50s. It pays homage. This movie that just came out, I actually didn't just come out. It was like 10 years ago, huh? Indiana Jones and the Temple of the Crystal Skull. Terrible movie, by the way. But it pays homage to these movies where Russians were the bad guys. During the Soviet Union, Russians were the bad guys, right? Or during the Cold War. We have better relations moving forward. Here you see Jimmy Carter and Brezhnev signing an agreement to limit nuclear weapons. Here you see Nixon and Brezhnev signing an agreement, SALT I and SALT II treaties. They're going to denuclearize to try to reduce the threat of nuclear war. They're called the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty Agreement, or the SALTs. SALT I, SALT II. Don't worry about the details. Okay. Charlie Wilson's War. If you want to watch another movie, I like to put the movies about this, if you're interested. Okay, let's not get into the Soviet invasion. I don't want to get into that. But if you're interested, I can tell you more. Let me know. Okay, Reagan, Star Wars. Let's not get into this. It's kind of interesting. Okay, the Cold War thaw continues. So, here's a famous speech from President Reagan. Let's watch this really quick. We're not going to watch the whole... Oh, that's not the speech. Stop it! Oh my gosh, it's frozen. Okay. Gorbachev becomes the Soviet premier. Mikhail Gorbachev is the new leader of the Soviet Union, and he is much, much more open than the previous ones. He is much more westernized. He's not nearly as hard line, as they say, and he's going to introduce some reforms in Russia called glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost means openness, like glass. You can see through it, transparency. And perestroika means a restructuring of the Soviet way. They're going to open up businesses. They're going to open up the country. Before, in Russia, if you wanted to buy an American-made product, you had to buy it on the black market. If it wasn't made in the Soviet Union, you couldn't own it. I want to show you a quick video of what the Soviet Union grocery stores looks like in the 80s. I don't know if you're getting audio on this. I can't remember. I think you are. But check this out. We'll skip around. This is what Soviet grocery stores looked like. They're very austere. They were bare bones. They did not have the grocery store shelves that you and I know. By 1989, the Soviet Union was in economic collapse. They were struggling. Guys, I was 5 years old. Wait, I was 4 years old when this was filmed. This is not that long ago. Okay, this is 1989, right? Here, this line here is for bread. They can't leave bread out because people will take more than their fair share. So you have to go through a bread line. In 89, Russia wasn't fighting a war. There was nothing going on in Russia other than the Soviet state was so deeply corrupt that their dreams of communism, where no one went hungry, were crumbling around them. And by the 90s, the Soviets were done with communism. Okay, they were done. Gorbachev will listen to Reagan's famous speech where he tells Gorbachev to tear down the wall, the symbol, right? And they do. What happens is people just start to tear it down. And the East German government, from the direction of Moscow, doesn't stop them. So they weren't told to take it down. The people tore it down. They just ripped it to pieces, and Berlin was unified in 1989. And this will mark the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union. Hungary will start to change its border restrictions. East and West Germany are reunited completely. Poland will break from the Soviet Union. Okay, here you have Rocky punching Ivan Drago right in the face. America likes to see this as America winning the Cold War. I don't know if that's a fair assessment, guys, if we won the Cold War. And I want to talk about this. There was a coup in 1991 where they, like, a tank drove up to the steps of the Kremlin. It's a little bit complicated, if you want to read more about it. But the Soviet Union was suffering. Okay, I don't want to think of this as like America punching Ivan Drago, the Russian guy. I don't want you to focus on America wins, USA, USA, right? You know, the Soviet Union was suffering. Their country was deeply corrupt. The Soviet people, the Russian people had a dream that communism would end poverty, would end classism, and unfortunately they were betrayed by their leaders. They were betrayed by people who they trusted, and millions of Russians will suffer at the hands of a corrupt Russian government. So I like to think of it less of like USA, we win, take it, suck it, Russia, like you're terrible, you lose. It's more like, um, it's more like, uh, I'm sorry that happened, Russia. That really sucked. Let's be friends. Okay? So the USSR dissolves. 1991, the president of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus signed what's called the I can never pronounce this, Belaveja Accord, declaring the USSR dissolved, and a new temporary government is put in place, the Commonwealth of Independent States. Russia will declare to what it is now. It's called the what's it called? The Russian Federation. It's known as the Russian Federation, with this new flag, as you see it there, the Russian Federation, and the Soviet Union is no more. That's right. How old was I? And I was 6 years old when the Soviet Union collapsed. So it's very recent history. This is considered the end of the Cold War simply because the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. But the Cold War wasn't really a violent, dangerous thing, anytime after the 60s. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, things were so calm that the war was really only diplomatic. I was raised during the Cold War. My first several years of life were during the Cold War, and I didn't know. I have to ask my mom and dad. They didn't really feel like there was a war. We did bomb drills in school, right? Because we might be bombed by the Soviets. But that was really just a relic of the 50s and 60s. So, what I want you to take away from this is this. Russia and the United States had very different opinions about how the world should work after World War II, and we didn't do a good job at getting along. Our goals of communism and capitalism did not work together well, and it led to a many year struggle in which millions of people will suffer. Hundreds of thousands of people will die in these smaller satellite wars. Millions will die in Korea and Vietnam. I didn't talk about Vietnam in this one. I'm going to do a separate video on Vietnam later on. I should put Vietnam in here. And maybe I won't do another video actually. So really quickly, Vietnam was like the Korean War except 20 years longer. It was about a 20-year war, and millions will die in Vietnam, and tens of thousands of Americans will die, all to try to stop the spread of communism. It was a juicy time, a very strange time. Email me if you have any questions. Thank you guys for listening. We almost made it a whole hour. You guys are dope. Catch you later. Thanks for watching. Bye.